Good evening, everyone. I would like to warmly welcome you to this session, Education Sector in Review, Optimising Technology. And this event is part of our Meet Melbourne Online Graduate series. My name is Steph DeCamo, and I am the Student Recruitment Coordinator at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. On your behalf, I would like to start today's session by acknowledging the traditional owners of the varied lands on which we're on today. I acknowledge the elders and descendants of the Wurundjeri people who are the traditional owners on the lands on which I am broadcasting. The Wurundjeri people have been and are the custodians of these lands, and I would like to acknowledge sovereignty was never ceded. I acknowledge that the land on which I'm on was a place of age-old ceremonies, of celebration, initiation, and renewal, and that the local Aboriginal peoples have had and continue to have a unique role in the life of these lands. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I also pay my respects to all Indigenous Australians attending our event today. So tonight for our event, we'll be exploring the topic of technology with a panel of our amazing academic experts. Before we get started, I thought I'd just go over a few housekeeping notes. We welcome your questions throughout the session using the Q&A function. We will answer your questions throughout the webinar, either directly or the questions will be addressed live with our panel. So feel free to start jotting those in there and our panel will get to them, or we'll get to them in the background. If you have any questions regarding our courses, you're more than welcome to submit them and our team will reply, or alternatively, we'll be putting in some information about how to submit an inquiry with us or book a one-on-one chat with our team where we can discuss which course might be right for you, entry requirements, or any other questions you might have. We'll use the chat function throughout the evening to share announcements and information with you. And lastly, a quick reminder that our session is being recorded and will be available to re-watch with you in the next few weeks. It is now my absolute pleasure to introduce our esteemed panel to guide our discussion today on technology. So firstly, I'd like to welcome Associate Professor Mark Selkirk, who is the Director of Digital Engagement and the leader of Artistic and Creative Academic Group. I next would like to invite Dr. Kate Coleman, who is a Senior Lecturer in Visual Arts Education Design. And finally, Dr. Catherine Smith, who is a Lecturer and Specialist in Digital Wellbeing. Welcome to you all.
Hello, everyone, and thanks, Steph, for the introductions. I think there's a fair few people out there to respond to and work with tonight. And Kate and Catherine, I'm looking forward to a bit of a conversation with you both about some of the issues that we'll raise. What we thought we would do, and I'll just give a bit of housekeeping as well, is what we thought we'd do tonight is run the session in two 20-minute blocks. The first 20 minutes, we have kind of thought about some questions or wonderings, and what we'll do is Kate and Catherine and myself will probably ask questions of one another and respond for a little bit. And there might be some provocations there that you might want to enter into the chat function as well to help with that. Then what we'll do is in the second 20 minutes of the session, we thought we sent everyone who registered a bit of a survey, and we've got some responses to those questions that we asked about. And what we thought we would do there is hone in on those questions and also see what comes up in the chat or the Q&A function there and respond to that. So that's kind of the structure that we'll work through today. I'm going to start briefly with my first question to both Kate and Catherine, and we've talked about some wonderings and some ideas, and what Steph has just put up, which I think is going to be with us for the rest of this little 20-minute session, is a few cartoons or depictions about what digital optimization or living in the digital world might be, and they might throw up a few provocations for you to be thinking about, and we might refer to those too. But what I'll do now is I'm going to pose Kate, are you ready? And Catherine, are you ready for my first question? All right, so my question to both of you is, what are the ways that you think education and how we particularly teach is preparing and promoting young people to be well, and I think well's a really important word in this day and age, and to remain connected in digital learning spaces. So I'd be really keen to hear your thoughts about that. Maybe I might start with Catherine, if you could go first in a response there.
Thanks, Mark. I think that we've probably had a big taster with regards to this in the spaces and places that we found ourselves in 2020 and teaching online. But I think probably what's most important that we consider is how we share those spaces with young people, because it can be a space that they occupy quite differently than we do as educators and as teachers. And it's a space where they sometimes find themselves to be able to promote their strengths in a way that they can't necessarily in real life or in the classroom in its traditional sense. So I think that that making sure that we share those spaces and actually kind of maneuver through them and navigate through them with young people that we're working with, helping us to kind of understand where they are and what they're up to, and where they're shining and where they find their passions in those spaces is really important. I think that just like the rest of the social emotional learning that we do with regards to kind of finding help and taking care and having critical conversations and, building good relationships, those things are really important to consider in the digital space as well as in the live classroom. And so having opportunities to explore that is also really important.
Thanks, Catherine. I think you've raised some good points there. And again, I couldn't but help be looking at some of those images on the slide when I was thinking about it as well, and it raised a whole lot of really interesting ideas for me. So, Kate, would you like to kind of respond? Thank you.
Yeah, I wrote myself a quick other answer, but while Catherine was just talking, I was thinking about the UNESCO sustainability goals. And if we actually think about how to create a safe and well and caring, sustainable future, then being digitally literate and ensuring that we have a digital inclusion program across all of our education spaces, whether they're in adult, continuing professional development, or they're in school-based spaces, then we can actually start to have a bigger discussion about what it means to be digital or what digital things are, because it's not like digital is one space, it's multiple spaces, and to be well across multiple spaces is actually really difficult. It's a hard thing to navigate, and one of the things that we need to be thinking all the time about is how we build knowledge of the digital to ensure that young people have agency and autonomy then to navigate multiple spaces that they can't see. And I think that that's, one of the most difficult bits, but it also plays into that really big idea about all of the things that we are and all of the things that we know, and all of the things that we learn, and how we might become, knowledgeable of a digital space. What does it mean to have a digital literacy, and what does it mean to have a digital inclusion within your teaching and learning programs, whatever it is, that wherever that might lie in education. And then how we have a digital society so that you don't have illiteracy in digital spaces. We have, 10% of the world currently illiterate in their own languages. What does that mean in digital spaces then is really problematic if we don't think about sustainability of these environments. And because that's where our wellness comes from, the whole kind of planet functioning, and thinking about those futures. So it's a huge question that I place back in those sustainability futures, and not necessarily just in the hands of the digital, but the digital being everywhere in all of that.
Sure. And I was just going to, before we move on to the next question, just again, the notion of teaching. And again, I'm assuming most of our audience is thinking about teaching in some form or other. And so, what do we do as educators to promote that in our teaching, I suppose, is a key thing, is to rather make the assumptions about what do we do. And, building on your points, Catherine, about, working with and alongside and supporting, they're kind of interesting concepts to be thinking about. Well, not necessarily interesting, they're probably fundamental to what we do, but sometimes they're a given that sometimes we forget about in the work that we do, yeah?
Yeah, we do.
Yep. And how do the skills that we would use in a real face-to-face classroom vary, or what's the transferability of those when we move into digital spaces as educators, and how do we make those kind of exist, I think are really open things. I was going to suggest maybe, Kate, we might go to your question.
Yeah, please, because I think it builds on this idea of digital worlds and digital spaces and divides and inclusion as well. So I think I'll ask this of Mark first and then Catherine. How do we prepare ourselves as educators and those we work with for informed digital citizenship? To be a digital citizen.
What does it mean to be? What does it mean to be a digital citizen? I think that's what does it mean to be a citizen, regardless whether it's in the digital or in any other world? And, you know, I think it's kind of a loaded question in some ways. What does being a citizen mean, and where does the individual fit in relation to a society? And they open up all of those kind of questions. And I'm thinking, again, that lovely little diagram there of the cartoon of the pills, or the sheep that's kind of like a brain there eating out of Facebook, is what is kind of a citizen's role in engaging in those kind of conversations in social media, and what sort of identities and personalities you have in those kind of spaces compared to digital learning spaces. And again, there's some things there about, you know, who we are and how we behave, and how we want to project. I think there's some interesting stuff that I know I've talked about in coordinating a course, and with us being online very often and working with pre-service teachers and talking about what they might have on their websites or their Facebook pages, and becoming a teacher and what that might mean for them. And one of my kind of rules of thumb is, would your mum or would your mother appreciate what's on your Facebook site? And if the answer's no, maybe you're not kind of projecting the kind of citizen you might need to be when you put your professional hat on, which most of us would be professionals in those ways. So there's a kind of interesting way of thinking about it, I suppose.
It is, it's right. I mean, it shouldn't be that the digital citizen should be different to the citizen that just exists in the everyday world. Otherwise you end up in some, I guess that's maybe that's where we get those very unwell spaces from. Catherine, yeah. What thoughts?
Yeah, I think that just like in any citizen space, we need to be aware of the privilege that we carry into that space as well. So I think some of the work that we do around digital citizenship is kind of our next step away from just kind of thinking about teaching cyber safety, and moving into thinking about the rights and responsibilities that we take into those spaces and how we negotiate them in that way. I think that privilege carries over into a lot of digital spaces. Plus we have a digital divide where people are in those spaces and not. But what we also kind of find, I think, and the research shows, is that you know, young people don't necessarily have the role models in their digital spaces that they would have in real life and in the other spaces that they kind of inhabit. And so there's no one there to kind of, you know, necessarily ask the questions that you might like to ask about how to do something, or what to do something. I know that that there's been some research happening with young people, like co-designed research with young people about just how to play and how to bring your game, as it were, to kind of spaces where they start to socialize, and looking for relationships and stuff, and thinking a bit about what the rules and regulations and morals and ethical kind of boundaries are there. And I think that having the opportunity to kind of really look at where we kind of draw the lines and what we think is right and wrong in those spaces is also a big part of digital citizenship.
Yeah, and I think, you know, that notion, I think, which is a key one, is that empathic, or whether it's we talk about empathy or understanding the spaces when we're in together. Like even tonight, I suppose the three of us who work together quite well, we've you know, in real spaces, but in here, how we're trying to have a bit of a conversation that is respectful of one another, and we're listening to people's points of view, and it's moving those dispositions that we would have and how they have to be practiced differently potentially in these kind of spaces. And what we say again tonight, one of those key things with digital citizenship is this is being recorded. So what we say and how we perform, it's going to find its way to be there forever, rather than a conversation that we might be having in the passageway or whatever, and what that means for us. So it's constantly being aware of whether, I think it's kind of partly that thing about we're potentially under surveillance all the time in that digital space in various ways.
Yeah, that is so true.
Yep. Yep.
Well, I might ask a question now then.
All right.
So with the shifts, if you can call them that, but anyway, whatever we call them, the move to online with COVID, we all tried many different ways to optimize our technology uses, and we saw some really interesting and quite amazing advances. There was lots of talk about how we should adopt these into our practices, but there's also some talk about, it appears that many want to go back or snap back to how things were pre-COVID and kind of step away from the Zoom space and all the other kind of digital advances that we've made. I'll start with Mark. Mark, what are your impressions or experiences about this?
Well, look, I think they lend, again, I think these questions all roll into one another, and I think it's partly, a reaction or a result of us. What happened to all of us last year was kind of a really fundamental understanding that the world, we can't necessarily control the world, and there's things beyond us that we probably thought there was some certainty previously. And I think maybe that snapback or the wanting to go back to how it was before is partly a melancholy, or wanting to go to I remember my parents talking about the good old days and whatever that means, but that they kind of lived through the war, and what that meant for them is a very different kind of fundamental shift occurred as a result, and how people deal with shifts and change and the uncertainties. And I think we had multiple uncertainties before COVID, but COVID actually lent a whole lot of new uncertainties that we couldn't control in our world. There's the whole notion about how people work in precarious work and how people study and manage their lives, and how the digital is a space where I'd suggest up until COVID, it was much more used in that social kind of, and we could choose to possibly opt into it, whereas for last year, most of us, we were forced there for a lot more of our time than we were ever before, yeah? And I just remember kind of the snapback for me is going back to campus and realising a lot of people weren't just two-dimensional. They had a front and a back and a side rather than just a face view. So to me, it's kind of caught up in that sort of wanting to go back to what it was like before, but realising that we never go back, it's always different. And we can't go back to what it was like before as a result, because I think there were some good fundamental things we learnt during that time that we need to move forward, and that's kind of a reality for me in some ways.
Kate, what do you think?
I think that there's some loss and mourning in what was lost that we don't go back to, but we do have some time to grieve. I think in education, there were ways that we did things before remote teaching. And I really still don't call that digital learning, but remote online emergency teaching was maybe not the best thing for everybody. Some people that, going back to digital literacy, people who had those literacies were able to design spaces differently. They could think differently about materials and methods, and they could use the mediums. But if you didn't have those literacies, then you do want to go back to what you're mourning, which was, for many of us in education, the thing that we love is a collaborative relationship. We have dialogue and discourse around ideas, and the tools and the technologies and the digital spaces can enable them if you know how to do that. If you have an active digital citizenship, if you have digital literacy, if you're not in the marginalized groups. And I think that kind of reified it for me. And so for some people who want to snap back, it was that they didn't have the access in the beginning, and the access just continued. What I saw, though, which was outstanding, because I'm an art and design educator, is artists and designers change their practice, not necessarily going digital, but just altering the practice altogether. And that means we can't snap back because we changed. You know, the galleries changed. The galleries changed the way that student work is now exhibited online. The teachers themselves thought, like I do, my students now have take-home packs. They never had take-home packs before. But they don't have to come here and privilege a physical site. They can work in multiple spaces and digitally exhibit their work. Everything changed so much that I kind of have time to mourn what changed and then go, this stuff was awesome. Let's work out how to do the awesome stuff. And then we'll, you know, we'll have this different experience about maybe what comes next. And the what comes next, I think, for all of education is the bit we're always chasing. The what comes next is why we're interested in education, whether we're, you know, in nurse education or teacher education or professional education. There's something about, yeah, what might come. And that's what I've learned out of last year, because this year my colleagues in Europe and America are still living what we were in. And they've had a different time to focus on the mourning and the loss, and then pull forward. And it's exciting to see what they've done. Wholly change everything and rethink. And, you know, I think that's a really lovely thing to come out of. How do we reimagine education? It is a lovely idea.
Yeah, and I was just going to build on that briefly. Is I think, you know, again, it's thinking back to the fog of last year of what we were all going through, and remembering how teachers, and I'll just talk this as an example, how teachers became kind of superstars in recognition of the work they did, where, you know, remote schooling, where kids were at home learning, and parents engaging more than ever probably with their kids learning and what was going on, and understanding the work of teachers. I think there was just some really fundamental shifts in our understandings about what education was and what schooling is about, and all of those kind of things that, you know, they're great legacies that I hope we'll be able to carry forward, really, and privilege, you know, the people who are working in those spaces, whereas, you know, the views of teachers prior to that were probably seen in some ways not necessarily in high esteem, but kind of it raised some of those ways of thinking about professional staff, you know, those that work in the profession markedly, I think.
I think one of the things that really has stood out for me too is just how much we recognize now the social kind of aspect of school and learning and the work that teachers do. Yep. In terms of that. And how, you know, how we saw those kids that were able to kind of stay socially connected fared so much better than kids who didn't have that opportunity during our lockdowns. So.
Yep. But I also thought it was, again, building on that, Catherine, I thought it was really interesting to see how, like even the education department listening and talking to schools and directing what kids should learn. And, you know, it came back to some very basic things of not necessarily what we talk about, the crowded curriculum that we have. There were some fundamentals, and there was ensuring that going back to those first questions about making sure kids were connected and people were connected, coming back to those fundamental skills about what we need to know to be human, came to the fore again, and cleaned some of the decks of some of the other, sometimes what we might describe as busy things we need to do in education, or, you know, even things like NAPLAN tests went. And, you know, they're a contested idea, but, you know, they weren't seen as important last year for some reason, which I think is a really interesting thing. There's a couple of Kate's typing a question to someone. Kate, did you want to answer those questions that are in the open questions?
There was a question about art education that I answered before, but this one is about the relationship between educators and peers and reduced barriers, and how we come to understand knowledge and digital learning processes. And I was just going to answer that. I think that how we come to know has changed, and the places that we know in, and I think that's exciting. I don't think that that's a deficit. I think, you know, I worked at home and I saw young people around my neighborhood that I didn't even know existed, you know, out riding their bikes, and I loved the interventions of kids in parks all over Melbourne. And I don't know if anybody lived near one, but kids digging holes and making ramps between trees, and the councils didn't do anything. I went around and photographed them all because I thought that it was the most amazing intervention. Kids turning parks into parks for kids. And that stuff I think is amazing. So how we came to know was different. How we came to know each other was different. We saw marginalized groups differently. We saw literacies and access differently. And so maybe it's a different year of knowing what we knew the year before, but that doesn't mean that it's a problem. And maybe it will open up a rethinking about how kids get to play in their neighborhoods. I mean, there was one day I was watching a kid drive around with a giant spade that he must have got from his grandfather's garage, because they don't even make spades like that anymore, because he'd been up altering the park to do jumps on his BMX. That wouldn't exist in an afternoon otherwise, because the kids are at school and then they go home and then they do the homework, they race off to sport training. So the community changed, families changed. There are some problems in those spaces that we saw for people who don't have access to things in the same ways. And I think that will just allow us to, rethink what the possibilities might be.
Yep. I think we should move to, because we did ask people to post some responses and we did get some. So I think it's be good. We're having such a good conversation. I'm forgetting there's a whole lot of other people out there probably listening in. It's one of the problems with this kind of webinar that we're dealing with is we know that there's 35 people out there, but we really can't see you. And it's sort of like being a bit of a radio broadcaster on some occasions, this format, but we do want to get to some of those questions. So I was going to ask Steph, we've got another slide there. Steph, thanks for putting that up. And we'll just move into, we thought there was about 10 questions we sent out and we got a few responses, which was great. We thought we'd try and make this as interactive as it can be in the time that we had, but we're going to focus on a couple of questions that were in that survey that we sent to you and just work through those. And so the first one was, there was a question around, in what ways would you like to see technologies used in education? And I was going to, again, maybe let Catherine or Kate sort of build on the ideas that came through, talk about those maybe, or give your own sort of views about what you see there.
I can start. I think that, well, there's two parts to my answer to this question. I think that they should be used in all ways in education. I think that there's so much possibility in kind of exploring the different ways in which we learn and the different kind of mediums that we can kind of engage with. They're great equalizers, in technologies as well. And people can explore different identities with it in ways that are really important. So I think that there's so many ways in which we can learn about, learn in technology. But I also think that while we are making those great progresses with, AR and VR, and while we're kind of moving ahead with learning and simulations and things, we need to make sure that we're being aware of the digital deserts that are within our communities and where people don't have the access or enough devices or the bandwidth to be able to kind of participate in the same way. And I think one thing we learned from the pandemic was that there are more people out there who don't have that access than we recognized, I think, in school communities, and how we address that at the same time as continuing to explore those spaces is really important.
Yeah, great. I think there's a couple of good words on here, particularly infrastructure and complex and speed. I think that, they are the things that I guess come back to this digital citizenship and digital literacy. Not all of our homes have the infrastructure to do what we do at schools. And so I think that there was an assumption sometimes that things could just go online. But really what we were doing was trying to create digital communities. And that requires then an infrastructure, a speed to actually enable that, because to even just to have the communication here function well and have clear cameras, ensure that there's no lag, no one's dropped out yet, is that we've got relatively good internet. And we know that that's not the case. You know, we know that some families run on mobile devices, which is a high functioning, high speed computer. But as soon as you want to run multiple Zoom rooms, that becomes problematic. You know, so that infrastructure is an issue, and then its relationship to the speed and the complexities of understanding how to engage in space. You know, so who's teaching all of that? Because the remote emergency teaching bit didn't necessarily have time to teach it. And so we tried to optimize the technologies in the last 12 months to do what we needed them to do. And I saw teachers hack technology so amazingly, turn, you know, chat functions in their room into the care space where they could just, even if we're off, one by one in private chats, ask how their students were. You know, there was a, which may not have happened in the physical classroom to the same extent, and families be able to tell stories for things. I heard recently about a student in the US who had just passed her Viva for her PhD, and in the middle of the presentation, her mother burst in and grabbed her daughter and hugged her. Now, that couldn't have happened in real life. That person would have been in a room in front of that panel, and one of my friends was an examiner and took a photo of it, just because it was such an amazing thing to see that technologies had optimized relationships with people. You know, it had altered things. So I think that we've seen, like Catherine was just saying, we've seen some issues that we need to do some work around. And then we've seen educators and students hack those technologies and make them do what they need to do, which is, you know, I think amazing. That's the bit about sustainability that I think is lovely.
Yeah, okay. And I was going to move to the next one, which was another question that we had, which was, what are the opportunities, and you've probably started to talk about that, Kate, the opportunities for optimising technologies in education. You know, some of the feedback we got in relation to that is in relation to, you know, cooperation and partnerships between whether it's schools or companies or those kind of things, how we maybe make it more accessible for marginalised communities. These are some of the feedback that we got in relation to the questions that we ask, how it creates career opportunities or it becomes more robust and fair assessment techniques. You know, some of those questions about how we do use it to its best potential, whatever that is. That word optimising is a really interesting one to even be thinking about, is if we optimise it for someone or something, is there a consequence for someone else or something else as a consequence? And that's always seems to be what we need to think through, you know. How do we do it fairly and equitably? A lot of this comes back to our fundamental principles and morals and ethics, yeah, in lots of ways, as to who is education for, what's it about, how does it work, all of those kind of things. So just again, your kind of views about how we might optimise it, Catherine?
I think I was just thinking about this morning how I got a student who was unwell, and often I get, right now, because our students are all over the world, I get sick messages, you know, like doctor's notes, but in other languages that I don't read. So I have to get someone to kind of check them for me. And this morning I realized I could use Google Translate to take a picture of it, and then it would translate it for me automatically. So suddenly the technology was working in my favor. And I think that, you know, that's the kind of spaces where, you know, optimizing kind of the opportunity to kind of communicate, you know, setting up closed captioning so that everybody can kind of engage with the speeches. All of those sorts of affordances that we get from technology are so exciting and so enabling. So, you know, I think that that's a really important part of that work. I think that there are also ways in which we can collaborate in different spaces and places in ways that we didn't before. And I'm also really excited about the opportunities that provides. Okay.
Yep. Kate.
I think that the collaboration bit is key. You know, so, and I think some of those answers responded to that, which is that something that digital spaces enable are the collaborations beyond physical space that are sometimes really difficult. So the international ones, the ones beyond the classroom, you know, just in art and design, you know, for many years, we've used Google Art and Culture to visit galleries that we couldn't go to. But that seemed to always be the not best solution. But now that became the normal, it's actually then, so what's the next bit, and how might we optimize the technology to do the next bit of collaboration? And what might that person be, which we've now seen the NGV do. You know, people take us on virtual tours, but not having to navigate Google Street View on my own in a gallery, but having a person walk with a GoPro on. So I think that collaboration means that we can connect beyond sites, and that's that became real things across places that potentially hadn't used that kind of thinking before. And that means that we've built a digital literacy, and that's still not accessible to everybody, but those digital literacies that enable new collaborations are really exciting. You know, what does the school do with an industry partner now, and how might, you know, for years we've been able to engage with astronauts through NASA online. We've been able to watch Panda Vision. All of those things have been real, but they actually changed the way we used them in teaching, because school teachers actually started curating those into lessons, which they may not have done before. And that meant we were collaborating, again, beyond sight and thinking differently about what the technology might enable us rather than seeing it as a tool. I think that's the biggest change for me. Collaboration means that technology is not a tool. Digital spaces are collaborative. And that's been a good shift.
Good. I was just picking up, there's a question in the Q&A about values from Eleanor about values education. I was thinking, Catherine, you maybe, did you want to make any comments there about that?
Yeah, I was just typing an answer, so
yeah.
I'm really happy to. I think that there's also some really interesting ways to explore the way that values are informed through technology. And one of the things that I found was really important in teaching well-being during like completely online, and that I use completely online, is I use a lot of simulations and gameplay to explore how the body feels as it makes decisions in a virtual space, as opposed to, you know, in the actual space. Because part of that embodiment, part of that kind of the messages that our body sends us through emotion and affect, are part of the way in which we make values, you know, we form our values decisions, and the way in which we kind of inform that what we think is right and wrong and good and bad. And so there are really kind of exciting things about doing this work. You just, you know, you have to be overt and explicit about it a little bit to start. But in kind of finding how people feel and, you know, actually explicitly talking about that sort of work, it gives us an open opportunity to also kind of experience how others are responding, and how that might be different or the same, but a little bit more understanding comes from those conversations around why people might react in different ways to different situations. And there's a real growth in cognitive empathy as a result of that I think is really exciting. I think that that's been probably one of my favorite things to find out in the last year, about kind of how gamification and simulations can really make a difference in that space.
Thanks, Catherine. There's just another question there by George, and again, it's an interesting one, and I'm not sure whether it's the intention of George's question, but it seems to be on occasions it's seen as a binary or an either or, in relation, the question being about the synergy of teachers and students using in the classroom. And I don't think any of us would be disputing the fact that there is nothing as magical as being in a space together in real time and doing things. And like Kate, my background is in visual arts, and the sense about being in a room where there's people making together and whatever else is a very different experience. And I suppose what we're suggesting here is how it complements or it enhances, or using it where it's required is how I'd be responding to that. I would never be advocating that we can completely move. I don't ever want to be in a situation like I was last year, where the only option was Zoom as the only way of interacting, and how we kind of think about how we use it for its advantages, and acknowledging that it will have some disadvantages that we don't want to sort of explore, because it's not going to serve the purpose for what we need to do in the space. There's another question come in there. I suppose what I wanted to do was just go to another question that we had, and that was because it's the interesting one again about the imagining and thinking about technologies. And if we think, 20 years ago where we were in relation to technologies, maybe was social media ever even around in 2001? And kind of this kind of work was never thought of. So thinking 20 years into the future and optimising technologies and digital technologies, I suppose, in particular, and what that means from where we will be. Any thoughts, Catherine or Kate?
I will, because I love this. I was a part of a think tank for UNESCO last year on thinking about the year 2050. And that think tank series was really hard for people to get their heads around, because they were thinking that they wanted digital technologies to be equitable. But in 2050, they should be beyond equitable. Like we should work out the equity issues really right now, because they were shown to us. And so then what we came to, it was almost going back to citizenship. What do you want from humanity, and how do we want a caring world, which brought us back to literacies, capabilities, citizenships, removal of, which was really interesting, even though it was about digital, but ensuring that we don't have racist, class-based, literally trying to change the activisms of the world, and how we might use the digital to advocate for change. And it was an amazing process to be in, to get away from those binaries of, I want technology to do this for me, or I think the future might look like this, which is, filled with robots, and therefore there's a deficit model because teachers can't be teachers anymore. But let's think differently than all of that, and think about what we want a future to be, and then how does digital actually enable some of those encounters. And it was a really lovely thing to think with, how might we wonder about a future, and what do we want from a future? And then how do we make sure that we make the technologies do that for us? Because we worked out how to optimize technology. I mean, I've seen teachers hack things so amazingly, which they might not see as a hack, but was a really good hack of a program to change it the way they needed to. And so how might we use those things and keep those changes happening so that those hacks keep going on? I think will be exciting. I want an equitable world. I don't want people to be illiterate and to live in poverty. So how do I think then about what technology can enable me to do, and what's the role of education in there? Well, we're all in education because we believe it's everything. Education is the political space that enables that to happen. So we all have to imagine that together. You all in this, in this space with us need to work out how we do that stuff.
I keep puzzling in this space about how we teach computational thinking, and understanding how the spaces, the digital spaces that we inhabit are built, on a binary eventually. I know quantum computing and stuff, but just at the base of that, there are so many biases and things that can be hidden in the work that we do in the digital space. And I wonder how we keep people aware of the decisions that they make in those spaces without scaring them away from kind of taking those chances, How important do you think that computational thinking is? Mark?
What was that, Catherine? Sorry.
How important do you think that computational teaching is? Like thinking, teaching computational thinking and teaching about how these computers and things, the technologies work and the biases that are fit inside them and stuff. Do you think that's important?
I think it's fundamental, surely. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? Otherwise, we're just users of something that we don't completely understand. And I would suggest we're never going to completely understand it unless we are in a virtual, in that kind of niche world where a lot of those decisions are made. And again, I suppose it's thinking about how do we continually be critical, interrogate, as I said, the points I raised before about, who wins, who loses, who's advantaged, who's disadvantages, who's silenced, all of those kind of key fundamental principles. And I think even in our education systems where that computational thinking or, teaching about coding, so the mystery of what and how things work, we can have a much more clearer understanding about what they might be is really important. It raises those questions of, do we want robots being teachers, and will they be better teachers than, humans, or, is that what we want to do, or is that not what we want to do, and who makes those decisions for us? And, I think, again, coming back to Sam's point there, which is kind of back at in some ways a bit of a rudimentary level, talking about a learning management system, something like Canvas as a platform. I go back to my arts education background in relation to what we're doing here is simply a tool. We have to enact it. We have to think about what we do with it and how we use it. And, by using a pencil, it's only a tool that I can make certain marks with, or someone else can think about it differently. So how do we encourage people to think about using the digital spaces and the tools that are provided and the language I was going to say is in a way that's for good, not for bad. And, to me, some of that fundamental of what's good and what's bad has been one of those questions we've had forever. In relation to, and I don't think it's any different till now. Yeah, I think those still things apply. Is what, how are we using technologies and digital spaces for good, and what that means is about good and what's bad, I think is a continual perpetual question we need to ask.
I think computational thinking needs to be taught explicitly like we do languages. It's a language. So if we believe that we need to be multilingual, bilingual people, then that also must include computational languages. It can't just include spoken language. It needs to be a language that is going to help us into the future. It's one of those futures. It's one of those language issues that I want in 2050. We need to rethink language, and we need to shift away from an anglophonic world that just says that the English language is the one that we must know. We need to have a multilingual, intercultural space, and that's got to be one of our common languages, not English.
I think that's a really good provocation to finish on, Kate, I think. I'm going to hand back. I think we're at the point where we can hand back to Steph. Is that okay, Steph? Is that a good segue back to you?
Thank you so much to our panel for such an insightful, engaging discussion. And I want to thank the audience members for your amazing questions coming through and really engaging in this topic. We hope you enjoyed the event this evening, and it did give you a bit of a sense of the kinds of thinking and the discussions that are held in our classrooms, and importantly, with our wonderful researchers and our experts here in the room and beyond about the types of things that we're thinking about at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. So you'll notice in the chat, we've got a link there to book a one-on-one appointment with our staff. So please utilise that if you've got any further questions about our courses or any questions that you have around life at MGSC. Or you can submit an inquiry as well, and those links are in the chat for you there. So I want to again thank you so much for being a part of today's event. We hope to have the opportunity to welcome you to the Melbourne Graduate School of Education, either in one of our courses or at one of our future events. Have a great evening, and thank you again.